The world knew Chase Hendricks as a musical god, a man whose voice was worth billions. But on one fateful night at the Orpheum Theater, he made a catastrophic mistake. Under the blinding glare of 1,000 spotlights, Chase chose to use his immense power to target the most vulnerable person in the room, an 11-year-old girl named Zara Williams. He didn't pull her onto the stage to give her a chance. He dragged her there to mock her poverty, her cheap uniform, and her dreams, all for the entertainment of 2 million viewers watching live. To Chase, Zara was just a prop to be broken, but he had no idea he was standing next to his own destruction. As the music began to swell, Chase leaned in and whispered a chilling command into Zara's ear. "Fail quietly, kid." He expected her to crumble under the weight of his fame, but Zara possessed a secret weapon that no amount of money could buy. She had perfect pitch, a rare gift that allowed her to hear the digital lies hidden within Chase's legendary voice. What started as an attempt to humiliate a child quickly transformed into a high-stakes technical war. In this gripping episode of A One Storyteller, you will witness the moment an underdog from Compton chose integrity over $1 million bribe. You'll see how a single impossible miracle note shattered a 15-year-old empire built on fraud and studio tricks. This isn't just a story about music. It's about the frequency of truth and the girl who refused to be silenced. Get ready, because the industry's biggest secret is about to be exposed. You are watching A One Storyteller. The air inside the Orpheum Theater was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the electric hum of 500 expectant guests. Under the blinding glare of the stage lights, Chase Hendricks stood as a god of the music industry, his star-mannered blazer shimmering with every calculated movement. He was at the peak of a career built on 4 platinum albums and the adoration of millions. But in that moment, he chose to use his immense power to target a child. His voice, usually smooth and melodic, turned into a blade as it sliced through the theater's acoustics. "You there? The black girl in the back with the cheap uniform. Come up here, now." The command was not an invitation, but a summons, meant to exert dominance in front of the 2 million viewers watching the live stream online. Zara Williams, only 11 years old, felt the eyes of the world turn toward her like a physical weight. Her hands trembled violently as she stood, her small frame swallowed by the grandeur of the theater. She tried to apologize, her voice a mere whisper, but Chase was not interested in her words. He reached out and grabbed her shoulder, his grip firm and controlling, dragging her into the center of the spotlight where the heat of the lamps felt like a judgment. "Let's see if you can actually sing or if you're just taking up space." He sneered, his smile fixed for the cameras, but his eyes cold and predatory. He snapped at the band to play Higher Ground, the very song that featured the impossible whistle register note that had made him a millionaire. As the music began to swell, he leaned in close, his microphone turned off so only Zara could hear his final, crushing blow. "Fail quietly, kid." The audience sat in a hushed, uncomfortable silence, sensing the cruelty but too enthralled by the spectacle to intervene, while Zara stood alone on the precipice of a public execution of her dignity. To understand the fire that was about to ignite, one had to look 4 hours into the past, to the quiet moments before the gala began. Zara had arrived at the theater with her stomach tied in knots, a feeling she was all too familiar with living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Compton. Her life was a series of calculations based on scarcity. She lived with her mother and 2 younger brothers in a space where the heater only functioned in a single room. Her mother was a nurse at County General, a woman who sacrificed her sleep in stolen 3-hour blocks to provide for them, while Zara took on the mantle of her caregiver, making mac and cheese and supervising homework. Money was a constant haunting question in their household, usually answered with a "not this month" or a "maybe next year." Music had been Zara's only sanctuary since the age of 5, when she first joined the second row of the New Hope Baptist Church choir. It was there that her choir director, Miss Johnson, discovered Zara possessed a gift so rare it defied logic: perfect pitch. Miss Johnson explained that Zara was 1 in 10,000, a child who could identify any note simply by hearing it, perceiving the world in frequencies that others were deaf to. While professional training at Berkeley or Juilliard was a financial impossibility, Zara taught herself the intricacies of vocal runs by watching YouTube videos on her mother's aging phone. She had developed an extraordinary range, from a D3 chest voice to a G6 whistle register, though she remained unaware that her ability to produce notes like wind chimes was a biological miracle. This secret knowledge, however, became a weapon during the afternoon sound check. While the choir waited in the wings, Zara had wandered near the stage and witnessed Chase Hendricks attempting the bridge of Higher Ground. She heard his voice, polished and expensive, suddenly shatter at an A5 full steps below the C6 he was famous for hitting. She watched as he snapped at his sound engineer to bring the track up higher, and she heard the transition to a recording. Because of her perfect pitch, Zara could hear the digital shimmer, the way the notes sat on top of the music rather than vibrating from a human throat. She realized in that moment that the industry's biggest star was a fraud. And as she stood under the lights 4 hours later, she realized he was trying to humiliate her because he knew she had heard the truth. She wore a white blouse from a discount store, the tag still attached so her mother could return it if they couldn't afford the expense. But as she looked at Chase, the fear of poverty was replaced by the clarity of the frequency she knew he couldn't reach. The silence that followed Chase Hendricks's whispered threat was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a room holding its breath before a disaster. Zara Williams stood in the center of that silence, the glare of the Orpheum Theater's spotlights feeling less like a stage and more like an interrogation room. Her mouth was so dry it felt like she had swallowed the very dust of the stage floor, and the grip of Chase's hand on her shoulder was a physical reminder of the power he held over her, the power of fame, of money, and of a curated public image that was currently being broadcast to millions. The band, sensing the tension, lingered on the opening chords of Higher Ground. The rhythm, a low, thumping heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the soles of Zara's discount store shoes. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, Zara felt the weight of her world, the cramped apartment in Compton, her mother's exhausted face after a night shift at County General, and the younger brothers who looked up to her for everything. She was a child being asked to humiliate herself for the entertainment of a man who viewed her as nothing more than a prop for his charity gala. But as the fear threatened to pull her under, a different sound began to echo in the back of her mind, the voice of her grandmother, steady and unwavering, saying, "Baby, if someone tries to make you small, you stand tall." It was a legacy of resilience that outweighed the platinum records and Grammys standing beside her. Zara took a deep, shuddering breath, feeling her diaphragm expand just as Ms. Johnson had taught her in the New Hope Baptist Church choir. She realized that Chase Hendricks was not afraid of her singing. He was afraid of what she knew. He was a man built on a foundation of digital shimmer and studio tricks, and she was the only one in the room who could hear the cracks in his armor. The transition from victim to challenger happened in the space of a single heartbeat. Zara reached out and adjusted the microphone, her hands still trembling but her eyes now fixed on the man who had tried to break her spirit. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, her voice small but carrying a newfound weight through the theater's state-of-the-art sound system. Chase's professional smile tightened at the corners, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his face. "Yes," he replied, his tone dripping with a condescension that was meant to keep her in her place. Zara didn't blink. "Can you turn off the backing track, please?" The request was like a grenade thrown into the middle of the theater. A confused murmur rippled through the 500 guests, and the live-stream chat, which had been a blur of idle comments, suddenly accelerated into a frenzy of speculation. Chase's smile froze into a mask of pure artifice. "The backing track is part of the arrangement, sweetheart," he said, his voice loud enough for the audience to hear, attempting to play it off as a child's misunderstanding of professional music. But Zara had already crossed the line of no return. She reminded him, with a calm that belied her age, that she had heard him sing without the track during the afternoon sound check. She saw the blood drain from his face as she asked the question that would seal his fate. "Then, can you sing it first? Show me how without the track." The power dynamic on the stage shifted instantly. Chase was no longer the benevolent mentor. He was a man being dared to prove his own talent by an 11-year-old girl from Compton. The audience, sensing a shift in the narrative, began to lean forward, their phones coming out to capture what they realized was no longer a scripted charity event. Zara's challenge was impossible, because she knew the answer before he even opened his mouth. The note he had built his career on was a lie. The tension reached a breaking point as Chase Hendricks was backed into a corner of his own making. To refuse would be an admission of guilt in front of 2 million people. To attempt it was a risk that could destroy everything he had spent 15 years building. His face flushed a deep, angry red, and he turned toward the wings where his sound engineer sat in the shadows of the mixing board. "Kill the backing track, all of it," he barked, his voice sharp with a desperation he couldn't hide. The engineer hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the faders before pressing the button that removed Chase's safety net. The music thinned out, the lush, studio-produced layers disappearing to leave only the raw, exposed sound of the live instruments. Chase raised his microphone, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He began to sing, moving through the first verse with the practiced ease of a veteran performer, his voice strong and controlled. For a moment it seemed as though he might succeed, as though the kid had been wrong and his legendary status was earned. But as the melody began its relentless climb toward the bridge, the physical toll of the range started to show. Zara watched him with the clinical precision of her perfect pitch, noting the way his neck tensed and his shoulders rose as he pushed his voice higher and higher. E4, G4, B4, these were notes he could handle, but the bridge demanded more. As he reached for D5 and E5, the smooth veneer of his voice began to fray at the edges, the strain visible in the veins bulging at his temple. The climax arrived with the inevitability of a slow-map car crash. Chase Hendricks reached the point in the song where the signature whistle register C6 was supposed to ring out, the note that had made him famous, the note that sat at 1046.5 Hz. He opened his mouth, his entire body bracing for the impact of the sound, but what came out was not a crystalline bell. Instead, his voice splintered like glass against a stone floor. He cracked violently at an A-sharp 5. A full step and a half below the target, the sound a ragged, desperate rasp that echoed painfully through the silent theater. He stopped abruptly, the silence that followed being even more deafening than the crack itself. He tried to laugh it off, blaming a dry throat and the fatigue of a long tour. But the damage was done. Zara, standing just a few feet away, didn't let the moment slip into an excuse. "You didn't hit it," she said quietly, her voice cutting through his frantic explanation. She explained to the stunned audience that she could hear the frequencies, that the note on his album was 1046.5 Hz, but what he had just sang was only 932 Hz. She laid bare the technical reality of his failure, explaining that the voice on his records didn't even sound like his own. It had a different texture, a different digital footprint. She brought up the name Sophia Mitchell from the album credits, a name the world had ignored for over a decade. In that moment, the myth of Chase Hendricks collapsed. The theater erupted into a chaos of whispers and gasps as the audience realized they had been paying for a lie, and the camera zoomed in on Chase's gray, ashen face as he realized that an 11-year-old girl with perfect pitch had just ended his career by simply demanding the truth. The Orpheum Theater had become a vacuum, a space where the oxygen seemed to have been sucked out by the collective gasp of 500 people and the silent shock of millions more behind their screens. Chase Hendricks stood paralyzed, his expensive blazer catching the light in a way that now seemed garish and mocking. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with the residue of his cracked note, a sound that continued to ring in the ears of everyone present like the final discordant chime of a dying bell. The king of the whistle register had been unmasked, but it wasn't just the failure of his voice that held the room captive. It was the clinical, unwavering precision of the child standing beside him. Zara Williams did not look like a revolutionary. She looked like a girl in a discount store blouse with trembling hands. Yet when she spoke, her voice possessed the weight of an absolute physical law. She was no longer just an 11-year-old from Compton. She was a witness to the fundamental mechanics of sound. "It's not just that you missed it," she said, her voice amplified by the silent house. "It's that you've never hit it, not for real." She looked at the audience, her eyes finding the cameras that were now zooming in so close that every bead of sweat on Chase's forehead was visible to the world. She began to explain the science of her gift, the perfect pitch that Ms. Johnson had identified years ago in the humid air of a Baptist church. To Zara, the world was not made of words or images, it was made of oscillations. Every sound had a number, a specific identity in the spectrum of air pressure. She explained that the C6 note Chase claimed as his signature was a frequency of exactly 1046 vibes, text, a crystalline vibration that required the vocal folds to oscillate over 1,000 times per second. The note Chase had just produced, she pointed out with devastating accuracy, had struggled to reach even $932.00 text vibes, the frequency of an A5. It wasn't just a mistake of performance, it was a biological impossibility for him. Zara's explanation took on the tone of a forensic investigation. She spoke about the digital shimmer she had heard during the sound check, a phenomenon known as aliasing or quantization artifacts that occurs when a recorded track is layered over a live microphone to create an illusion of perfection. She explained that a human voice, no matter how trained, has a natural jitter and shimmer, tiny beautiful inconsistencies in frequency and amplitude that give a voice its soul. But Chase's C6, the one on his albums and the one that usually played over the speakers during his live shows, was too perfect. It lacked the harmonic complexity of a real throat. It was a synthesized ghost, a 1046 550 seconds wave polished by software until it was nothing but a lie. The audience listened in a state of cognitive dissonance, watching the destruction of a legacy through the lens of physics. The technical blow was more damaging than any insult could have been, because it stripped away the subjectivity of talent and replaced it with the cold, hard data of acoustics. Chase's management team in the wings were frantically gesturing to the stagehands to cut the microphones, but the cameras belonged to a global stream, and the story had already outpaced their ability to control it. The fraud was no longer a rumor, it was a measured, documented fact, articulated by a child who heard the world in high definition. As the weight of the technical exposure settled over the theater, a new tension began to rise. A demand for the truth that could only be satisfied by the very thing Chase had failed to provide. The challenge he had thrown at Zara in a moment of desperate rage, "You sing it right now," had transformed from a threat into a pivot point for her entire life. Zara felt the shift in the air, the way the skepticism of the crowd was being replaced by a hungry, desperate curiosity. She looked at the band, the professional musicians who had spent years following Chase's lead, and saw them looking back at her with a mixture of pity and awe. She took a step toward the center of the stage, moving out from under Chase's shadow and into the full, blinding glory of the spotlight. This was the moment where the secret knowledge had to become a public miracle. She closed her eyes, shutting out the glint of the cameras and the faces of the judges, and reached back into her memory to the small apartment in Compton, where the heater didn't work and the only warmth came from the music she made in the dark. She thought about the physics of her own body, the way the Bernoulli effect would pull her vocal folds together, creating the rapid-fire vibrations needed to pierce the silence. She wasn't just going to sing, she was going to testify to the reality of her gift. When the band struck the first chords of Higher Ground for the second time that night, The atmosphere in the Orpheum was unrecognizable. The artificiality of the gala had been stripped away, leaving something raw and dangerous. Zara began to sing the first verse, and for a moment the audience was underwhelmed. Her voice was small, tentative, and light, a chest voice that stayed within the comfortable lower registers. But as she moved into the pre-chorus, the transformation began. She shifted through her passaggio, the difficult transition zone where the voice moves from the thick vibration of the chest to the thinner, more resonant head voice. It was seamless, a display of technical control that most professionals took decades to master. As the bridge approached, the point where Chase had splintered into pieces, Zara didn't slow down. She accelerated. She moved into the whistle register, also known as the flageolet range, where the vocal folds are stretched so thin that only the edges vibrate, creating a sound that is more akin to a woodwind instrument than a human throat. She reached the C6, the D6 to 546 hypertext note that had been Chase's undoing. And she didn't just hit it. She sustained a perfect sine wave of human effort that hung in the air like a silver thread. But the miracle was only beginning. While Chase's backing track had topped out at that C6, Zara realized she was finally in a place where she didn't have to be small. She pushed higher, moving past the D6 and the E6, entering a territory of the musical scale that was rarely heard outside of the most elite opera houses or the rarest R&B legends. Zara. She hit an F6, a frequency of 1396.9, 8 text. A note so high it felt less like a sound and more like a physical sensation behind the eyes of everyone in the room. It was the miracle note, a sound that transcended the industry and the fraud and the poverty of her upbringing. It was the sound of an 11-year-old girl claiming her place in the world. Yolanda Carter, the legendary singer in the front row, was no longer just a judge, she was a witness. Her face wet with tears as she watched a child do the impossible without a single digital trick. Marcus Webb, the man who had helped build Chase's lie, sat frozen, his hands hovering over the table as if he could feel the frequency vibrating through his own bones. Zara held the F6 for 5 seconds, then performed a perfect chromatic descent back down to the C6, before finishing the song with a soulful, grounded run that brought her back to the earth. When the final note faded into the velvet acoustics of the theater, there was a moment of absolute stunned silence. A silence that lasted only as long as it took for the world to realize they had just seen the birth of a legend and the death of a lie in the same breath. The echoes of Zara's final note did not simply fade. They acted as a solvent, dissolving the carefully constructed veneers of every professional in the room. For 15 years, the music industry had functioned on a silent pact of protection, a high-prized wall of silence, built to keep the myth of Chase Hendricks alive. But as Zara stood there, breathing hard, the sheer purity of her F6 note of frequency of 1396.996.9 text that no software could perfectly replicate with such soul, made the lie feel like a physical weight. The first crack in the industry's armor came from the wings. The sound engineer, a man who had spent 5 years of his life hovering over the playback button to ensure Chase's live performances matched his platinum records, stepped into the light. His face was a mask of exhausted relief. For years he had been the architect of the illusion, the one who layered the digital shimmer over Chase's cracking voice. But watching an 11-year-old girl risk everything for the truth had shattered his sense of professional duty. "She's right," he said, his voice trembling as it carried through the very speakers he had used to deceive the world. "I've played that backing track at every show. Chase has never hit that note live, not once." The betrayal was a seismic event. It was the sound of the machine grinding to a halt. Marcus Webb, the legendary producer sitting at the judges' table, stood up next. As a man who had built empires for artists, his word was gospel in the industry. He looked at the cameras, his expression one of profound shame. "I mixed that album," Marcus admitted, his voice heavy with the gravity of his confession. "And Zara is right about the credits. That's not Chase on the high notes. That's Sophia Mitchell. She was paid a few $1,000s to sign an NDA and disappear so we could sell a lie." This was the ultimate industry betrayal. Not a leak or a rumor, but a public dismantling of a superstar by the very people paid to protect him. The air in the theater turned toxic for Chase. He was no longer a legend, but a product whose warranty had just been voided by the truth. In the aftermath of the public collapse, the setting shifted from the glorious heat of the spotlights to the sterile, the predatory chill of the backstage corridors. The roar of the crowd was now a distant, muffled thrum, replaced by the sharp click of expensive shoes on the concrete floor. Robert Kraft, Chase's lead attorney, arrived like a shadow, his presence signaling the transition from a musical dispute to a legal war. He was a man whose suit cost more than the annual rent on Zara's Compton apartment, and he carried a leather briefcase that felt like a weapon. He didn't approach Zara with anger. He approached her with a terrifying, calculated kindness. "Miss Williams," he said, pulling up a folding chair as if he were a friend, "I'm here to resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding." He opened the briefcase to reveal a document that promised a future Zara had only ever seen in movies. A $50,000 0-cents full-ride scholarship to any music program in the country. To a child who had taught herself vocal runs on a cracked phone screen and lived in a house where the heater only worked in one room, this was not just money. It was a ticket to a different life. But the scholarship came with a price. Zara would have to sign a confession stating that her accusations were false, a mutual agreement that she had been seeking attention and had misunderstood the technical aspects of the performance. When Zara's mother and Ms. Johnson hesitated, Kraft's smile didn't waver, but his tone shifted into a cold, clinical threat. He spoke about damages, millions of dollars in lost tour revenue and canceled endorsement deals with Pepsi and Nike. He informed them that Chase's legal team was already preparing defamation charges, not just against Zara, but against Jefferson Elementary, and Ms. Johnson personally for failing to supervise a minor. He made it clear that the school district was already considering pulling its $500,000 0-cents music budget because of the liability Zara had created. "Sign this, take the money, and your family is set for life," Kraft whispered, his eyes locked on Zara. "Refuse, and you will watch your mother drown in legal fees, while your school loses its music program because of you. The choice is yours, kid, but remember, the world doesn't care about the truth as much as it cares about the bottom line." The document on the table seemed to pulse with a predatory energy, the $50,000 0-cents figure at the bottom glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the backstage room like a lure in deep water. Zara Williams looked at the signature line and felt the crushing weight of her reality. This wasn't just money. It was an escape hatch from the poverty that had defined every second of her 11 years. It was the tuition for the elite conservatories she had researched on her mother's cracked phone, the ones where people with her gift were usually welcomed with open arms. It was a future where her mother didn't have to sleep in 3-hour blocks between shifts, and where her brothers didn't have to share a single heated room in the dead of winter. But as her hand hovered over the pen, she read the words Robert Kraft had prepared. "I, Zara Williams, admit to making false and malicious accusations. I acknowledge that I misinterpreted technical audio cues." The ink felt like a confession of a crime she hadn't committed. She thought about the 1046.5 text frequency of a true C6, a note that existed in the world regardless of who tried to bury it. To sign would be to admit that the truth was a commodity that could be bought, and if her voice was for sale, then it wasn't really hers. She looked up at Kraft, whose face was a mask of cold, professional expectation. She looked at her mother, who was silent, leaving the weight of the world on her daughter's small shoulders. "No," Zara said, pushing the paper away with a finality that echoed in the small room. She chose her integrity over the $50,000 0 cents, deciding that being a poor girl from Compton who told the truth was worth more than being a scholarship student who lived a lie. She chose the uncertainty of a lawsuit over the certainty of a hollow life, knowing that by refusing to be bought she had just declared war on an empire. The retaliation was instantaneous and brutal, moving with the speed of a digital wildfire. By 6:00 a.m. the following morning, Chase Hendricks' high-prize PR machine had launched a coordinated smear campaign designed to incinerate Zara's reputation before the world could truly digest her talent. Zara woke to the sound of her phone buzzing like a swarm of angry hornets. The narrative had been flipped by professional spin-doctors. It was no longer about a singer who couldn't sing, but about a predatory family looking for a payday. Photos of Zara's apartment building, showing the peeling paint and the broken security gate, were circulated with captions that labeled them as evidence of a desperate motive. They weaponized her poverty, leaking her mother's modest salary and even Zara's free lunch status from school records to paint a picture of a child coached by a greedy mother to extort a superstar. On social media, the hashtag #ChaseIsTheVictim began to trend, fueled by bots and fanatical followers who saw Zara not as a gifted child, but as a threat to their idol. The harassment moved from the screen to the real world with terrifying speed. By noon, protesters stood outside Jefferson Elementary with signs calling Zara a liar and a fraud. The school board, paralyzed by the threat of a $10 million 0 cents defamation lawsuit and the loss of Chase's promised $500,000 0 cents music donation, caved to the pressure. Zara was called into the principal's office and told she was being suspended indefinitely for her own safety and to protect the school's reputation. She sat on her couch at home, watching the news cycle tear her life apart, realizing that the truth hadn't set her free. It had made her a target for the full, unchecked power of the music industry's elite. The darkness that had settled over the Williams household in the wake of the smear campaign was not merely the absence of light, but a thick, suffocating weight that felt like the end of hope itself. Zara sat on the edge of the worn sofa, the blue light from her phone illuminating a face that had aged years in a single night. The internet, which had briefly championed her as a hero, had been successfully weaponized against her by a team of professionals whose only job was to protect $1 million asset. The hashtags had shifted from celebratory to vitriolic. The narrative of a talented child had been replaced by the caricature of a clout chaser and an extortionist. Her mother, a woman who had faced the grimmest realities of the ICU at County General, looked more defeated by these digital lies than by any double shift. They were trapped in a classic David versus Goliath scenario, but in this version, Goliath had a public relations firm, a legion of bot accounts, and the ability to freeze Zara's education with a single phone call to the school board. The $10 million 0 cents lawsuit wasn't just a legal filing. It was a psychological siege. It told the world that the truth was too expensive for a family from Compton to afford. But as the clock ticked past 7, oh, clock, aiming, the first domino fell. And it didn't come from a courtroom. It came from a recording studio in Atlanta. Sophia Mitchell, the woman whose voice had been the invisible ghost behind Chase Hendricks' greatest hits, watched the news coverage of Zara's suspension with a growing sense of nausea. For 15 years, she had lived comfortably off the hush money of session fees and the occasional $2,000 0 cents payment for additional vocals, her identity buried deep within the fine print of liner notes that no one read. She had signed the NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, because she needed to pay her mortgage, and she had stayed silent because that was the professional thing to do in an industry that valued the star over the singer. But seeing an 11-year-old girl being dismantled for speaking the same truth she had hidden for over a decade broke something inside her. Neo hadn't demoted. Sophia didn't call a journalist. She opened her own laptop, turned on her camera, and opened the raw project files of Chase's platinum album. "My name is Sophia Mitchell," she began, her voice steady and resonant, the very voice the world had loved without knowing its name. "And I am done being a secret." In her videos, Sophia didn't just talk. She provided the technical receipts that the public relations firm couldn't spin away. She shared her screen to show the original Pro Tools sessions from 5 years ago. She played the isolated vocal tracks, the raw, unedited recordings of the C6 whistle register note. When she hit the solo button on the track, it wasn't Chase's masculine timbre that filled the speakers. It was Sophia's crystalline operatic soprano. She then played Chase's actual vocal take from the same session, which was a strained, breathy attempt that didn't even reach the G5 mark. The contrast was undeniable. She showed the vocal comping notes where the engineer had been instructed to blend Mitchell's high end into Hendricks' mid-range to create the hybrid voice the world thought was one man. She even showed the wire transfer receipts labeled Session Work Anonymous, which matched the dates of the recordings. This was the spark that ignited the chain reaction. Within 2 hours, Marcus Webb, the producer who had initially spoken up at the gala, posted a follow-up video with his own set of master files, confirming that Chase's live concert tracks were actually 100% pre-recorded. Sophia Mitchell vocals pitch-shifted down by a few semitones to sound more masculine. The narrative didn't just flip, it exploded. The hashtag #GiveZar surged to the top of the global charts, and by noon, 6 other session singers who had provided the high notes for Chase's tours over the last decade had come forward, each posting their own contracts and isolated vocal takes. The wall of silence had not just been breached, it had been demolished by the very people who had built it. The transition from a defensive struggle to a total legal offensive began at exactly 7:15 a.m. the following day when a black SUV pulled up to the curb of the Williams apartment. Diana Carter did not look like the corporate lawyers who worked for Chase. She was a woman who specialized in entertainment law with a reputation for being a giant killer. Having spent her career reclaiming the rights of exploited black artists from the 1960s and 70s, she walked into the apartment and laid a single business card on the table. "I'm not here to negotiate with them," Diana told Zara's mother. "I'm here to bury them." She explained that because Chase's team had filed a $10 million 0-cents lawsuit to silence a minor speaking the truth, they had opened themselves up to an anti-SLAPP motion, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. In the state of California, such a motion is a powerful weapon designed to protect free speech against wealthy interests. If successful, it wouldn't just get the lawsuit dismissed. It would force Chase to pay every cent of Zara's legal fees and potentially subject him to massive countersuits for harassment and fraud. Diana's strategy was surgical. While the internet handled the court of public opinion, she handled the court of law. She filed an immediate injunction against Chase Hendricks for consumer fraud, arguing that every ticket sold for a live performance featuring lip-synced vocals from another artist was a violation of consumer protection laws. The momentum was now a tidal wave. The major sponsors, Pepsi, Nike, and a high-end watch brand, didn't wait for a verdict. They saw the isolated vocal videos and the mounting evidence of a decade-long fraud and issued simultaneous statements terminating their relationships with Chase Hendricks effective immediately. His upcoming stadium tour, which was projected to earn $40 million 0 cents, was canceled by the promoters within 48 hours. The king of the whistle register was watching his empire vanish in real time. His brand transformed from voice of a generation, the greatest fraud in music history. But the final victory wasn't just about Chase's downfall. It was about the restoration of Zara Williams. Under the pressure of Diana Carter's legal team and the massive public outcry from parents across the city, the school board issued a formal public apology to Zara. The principal was forced to resign, and Zara was invited back to Jefferson Elementary, not just as a student, but as the guest of honor, at a newly funded arts gala. The $500,000 0-cents donation that Chase had threatened to pull was replaced tenfold by a new Truth in Music Foundation started by Yolanda Carter and Marcus Webb, ensuring that the music program Zara loved would be funded for the next 20 years. On the final day of the legal proceedings, Chase's team attempted one last settlement offer, a staggering $1 million, 0 cents, to end the countersuits and go quietly into retirement. Zara, standing beside Diana Carter, looked at the man who had tried to make her small. She didn't want his money. She wanted the world to know that a gift like hers couldn't be manufactured in a studio. She refused the settlement, opting instead to let the case go to a full public disclosure. The final victory arrived not with a check, but with a moment of pure, unadulterated justice. The announcement that Zara Williams had been offered a full, unconditional scholarship to the Juilliard School's pre-college program, not because of a charity deal from a fraud, but because the dean of the school had heard her hit that F6 note and recognized a once-in-a-century talent that didn't need a backing track to shine. Zara Williams started that night as an invisible girl in a discount store blouse and ended it by bringing a musical empire to its knees. She proved that the truth doesn't need $1 million marketing team. It just needs the courage to be heard. If you believe that talent should always beat a lie and that the underdog deserves their moment in the sun, then you belong here with us. This is A1 Storyteller, where we unmask the powerful and celebrate the brave. I'm your host, and this has been a story you'll never forget. Until next time, keep telling the truth.